So we have built a model named IziRisk at its English student version, in which we detail 10 different types of risks, of cyber risks, according to this reference tab. As you can see, there's a description over here. This is the link I got this information from. And as you can see, I have detailed 10 different types of risks, and then this is a risk register, and then I've splitted them into their two major components, a frequency component and a severity or impact component. In other words, for each one of them, I have built frequency distribution functions, and this is where we use IziRisk on top of Excel. IziRisk is an Excel-based app which allows you to do Monte Carlo simulation on top of Excel using distribution functions. For example, over here, we're using the binomial function. Any one of the frequency functions that we're using here is used for counting, for tallying events. So for example, if I were to turn on my distribution charts over here with the distribution charts button and enable them, I'd be able to see the chart of a binomial distribution in which this type of risk happens on 40 units, and there's a 10% chance or probability of any one of these units being subject to this risk. In other words, the number that is being generated over here, in this case a 5, or let's say a 6, a 4, 5, 7, etc. It's a number that is being generated by a binomial function using these two parameters. Another distribution function that can be used is the Poisson distribution, which only requires one parameter. This parameter is the average. So as you can see, a Poisson function, an IziRisk function with a parameter of 12.3 will give you the average number of times of lambda 12.3 that I'd be generating random numbers along the curve according to this Poisson distribution function. So every single time I hit F9, I am therefore generating random numbers according to this. Each one of the risks, as you can see, has been laid upon on its frequency side using either binomials or Poissons, or even an integer uniform distribution, which would yield even numbers of probability for each one of the numbers between the min and the max, 2 and 10 in this case. I can always go and turn off these distribution charts by disabling them, and I can go to the severity part, in which according to either PERTs or exponential functions or even uniform functions, I can start building distribution functions, for example, over here. In this case, for example, the severity of each one of the risk number 1 would go from a minimum of 40 to a most likely value of 80 to a maximum of 2000, therefore yielding this heavily asymmetric distribution function, a PERT one, with these three parameters being defined. A PERT is a very common and popular distribution because it only requires 3 parameters given by expert's opinion, by a subject matter expert's opinion. Or you could use, for example, the exponential, which with an average of 800 would always yield an asymmetric distribution that tends all the way to infinity, and in which, in this case, 0 becomes the mode. So as you can see, I've laid upon here different distribution functions for the magnitude or the severity or impact of each one of those risks. So the nature of Monte Carlo simulation here on this model would be to randomly generate many times over all these frequencies and severities, and therefore integrating them, as you can see, on column C. Column C contains the convolution function. A convolution function is a function that integrates, in this case, a frequency function, in this case a Poisson, and a severity or impact function, in this case a PERT. Each one of the cases has been built according to the frequency and severity of each one of the 10 different risks. And at the end, I generate all these numbers randomly each one of them with a convoluted function, and at the end I add them all up together on cell C12. Cell C12 has previously been declared an output cell, and it's called total cyber risk. Also, after mitigation, I've also declared cell N12, as you can see here, also as a mitigated total cyber risk after mitigation output function. In order to declare either cells as inputs, such as these ones, or outputs, such as these ones, you correspondingly use these two buttons. Input data for defining or removing different inputs, and output data for defining or removing them altogether. Show inputs and outputs would show you the list, in this case, of 10 different inputs and of 2 different outputs that the model has. Once this has been laid upon, I can start running my simulation. In this case, I won't run it. As you can see here in parameters, I have previously defined 10,000 iterations, that is recalculations of each one of them. If I were to regenerate them over here, it would take me several minutes. In order to avoid those additional minutes, that simulation has previously been performed, either using here the submit and then the simulation, or going directly to the simulate button over here. Once the simulation is performed, I can go on top of this cell, the previously declared total cyber risk C12 output cell, and generate, for example, its histogram. In reading out of this histogram, I can read that the minimum total cyber risk, that is the aggregation of these 12 different risks being generated, can go to a minimum of 4,400 or a maximum of 16,300. On average, I would get approximately 9,200 on average with the corresponding percentiles. These percentiles can be changed. I can always come here to parameters and say that I wanted to use the 10th, let's say here the 10th and the 90th percentile. So I can define them here. I submit. I don't need to simulate again because the simulation has already been performed, but I can just go to histogram, and now the parameters or the percentiles that I'm seeing are respectively the 10th and the 90th percentile, respectively, with these two vertical blue delimiters. So that information is being given over here. For example, now I can state that there's a 90% probability that the total cyber risk will be less than 11,185. That's a reading of a 90th percentile. Now, since I've already done another case here, which is of purchasing some mitigation strategy, in this case a firewall, that would cost me $2,000, and it is promised to reduce 90% the likelihood or probability of the risks that it impacts. In this case, I've defined that risk number 1, number 2, and then number 5. These are the 3 risks for which, after mitigation, that is after the firewall has been put in place, I'll be able to reduce up to 90% the probability, therefore the frequency of each one of them. So you'd be able to see the functions here on row for the first risk here, for the second, or for the 5th. You'd be able to see a function on how does that convoluted formula would operate in case that you'd have a reduction on probability by mitigating. So as you can see here, I am making a reference to a binomial function in which there's a reduction of 90% on the probability, that is on the individual probability of the binomial that I'm using over here. In other words, I've got here 3 different risks that have been mitigated. Therefore, the aggregation, the sum of them all, this cell here is already considering the mitigation of these 3 risks. I can compare them after the mitigation has been run. So I can go, for example, on top of this cell after the simulation has been performed, and, for example, draw its total cyber risk after mitigation histogram. If I wanted to compare this one to this one, I can always use the S-curve and select this one and that one. So I'd be able to see how does the mitigation curve would look like after I've decided to mitigate on each one of those plans. Obviously, I can change this. If I were to say, for example, only reduce on 50% my mitigation strategy over here and then simulate again. In this case, after running 10,000 iterations on my simulation, I'd be able to compare now if it were to be worthy to purchase for $2,000 a mitigation strategy that only reduces not 90 but 50% of the probabilities on the frequencies of those 3 risks that I've decided to mitigate with my firewall. Now, I'm going to lead this all the way to the end and then temporarily stop my recording of this session until the simulation has been performed completely. So after the simulation has been performed, in this case reducing the probability from 90 to 50%, you would probably see that on the results of the mitigated results, we would have different ones. In order to compare them, I can always go and select S-curve, compares total cyber risk, again, cyber risk after mitigation. And as you can now see, they're probably they're almost always exactly matching. So it seems as though 50% is seems to be like the pivotal point to which it becomes profitable to purchase the mitigation strategy for $2,000. So this is the way in which a sensitivity analysis can be performed in this case when comparing two strategies. And obviously at 90% reduction of probability, it does make sense then to mitigate. Another type of analysis that can be performed here, which we overcame, was to do on top of a previously defined output cell would be a correlation tornado. A correlation tornado would give you a ranking funnel type chart in which you'd be able to see the correlation, the linear correlation coefficient between each one of the risks, and in this case, your total aggregated cyber risk. In this case, unauthorized access attempts to systems data becomes the most closely correlated risk with respect to the total aggregated one. So in this case, if I were to place myself on top of that cell, which is an input, and let's say generate a scatter plot of that one against total cyber risk, the output one to which it's related, you'd be able to see the 0.62 correlation coefficient that depicts the linear closeness of these 10,000 data points. There's 10,000 data points here because that's the number of iterations we performed on the previously run simulation here. So that's the way to see it. If I were to correlate any one of the other risks, which is not as highly correlated towards the total cyber risk, we would see reduced correlation coefficients such as this one, in which there's essentially no relationship at all between your phishing attack and the total cyber risk here. In other words, your correlation tornado is a way of ranking the relative importance of each one of your cyber risks with respect to the total aggregated risk. Now, you could also do the same type of analysis on top of correlation tornado, and you'd be able to see that after the reduction on these mitigation attacks, then some of these ones become essentially zero in their correlation to total cyber risk after mitigation. The other thing that you can see here is the statistic functions. Easy mean, easy percentile, and easy target can give you respective statistics, in this case with respect to a previously declared output cell, which in this case would be C12. So as you can see, this is referred to C12, this is referred to C12, this one as well, because they make reference to a previously declared output cell model C12. I guess this is a good explanation, a summary explanation on how does this cyber risk model works and how does it work on top of Excel with IziRisk. One limitation additional is that on the student version, you can run as much as 200 iterations instead of 50,000 iterations as a max on the professional version. That's the only difference that there is between the student version and the professional version. Thank you very much for your attendance to this short summary on Total Cyber Risk English student version with IziRisk.